Good morning to all of you. It's great to be here again. I tried to remember when we were here last. It was back in the summer, I think, but it's been, seemed like a long time ago in a way. Deborah and I had an enjoyable drive down from Searcy this morning, but I think we've decided that, Lord willing, next time we're going to come down on Saturday and stay in the house. But this last week has been her birthday week, and we celebrated it last evening in Little Rock with her brother and sister and their spouses, and so we really didn't have an opportunity to come yesterday. But I think if we can, we're going to make that change in the future. If you have a Bible with you, and I hope you do, if you will open to Psalm 31. Psalm 31. We're not going to study. Last time I was here, we studied just in Ephesians 1, and I don't know that we ever left the section we studied. But today we're going to turn from at different places at different times. So it'll be advantageous, I think, if you have a Bible and can follow along. Psalm 31 says that it is a psalm of David. We're not going to read the whole thing. Going to start at verse 9. Don't know exactly what's going on in his life, but it obviously is not pleasant. So please pay attention to the way he describes his own sense of affliction. Verse 9, "Be merciful to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and my body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak. Because of all my enemies, I am the utter contempt of my neighbors. I am a dread to my friends. Those who see me on the street flee from me. I am forgotten by them as though I were dead. I have become like broken pottery. I hear the slander of many. There is terror on every side. They conspire against me and plot to take my life. But I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hands. Deliver me from my enemies and from those who pursue me. Let your face shine on your servant. Save me in your unfailing love." And then the very last verse of the chapter, he ends by saying, "Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in the Lord." I'm going to guess that maybe not every... It is on. Can you not hear me? I'll just speak here. Maybe it needs to be higher. Is that better? All right. I'm sure that many of you will identify with David, his expressions about being worn out, in anguish, in grief, sorrow, all of these kinds of ways of describing feeling rejected by friends, neighbors, and so on. And I would say, and in fact, I couldn't help noticing that your prayer list is about as long as any prayer list in any church I've been in some time. That's a long prayer list. A lot of cancer. That's not, your list may be longer than many I've seen that are printed, but I think on any given Sunday, when we meet, we realize that there are many people that we know who are caught up in various kinds of pain and agony and sorrow and distress. People who have lost jobs, who are facing serious surgery, who just got a cancer diagnosis, or maybe they're brokenhearted over their children, decisions they're making. All of that the result of living in a fallen world. And sometimes it just seems like it's overwhelming. There's so much of it. I want to begin by talking about making 4 brief observations about our suffering. And then we will venture into some specifics about all of this. Our suffering can help us release our grip on the world. We cling tenaciously to this world. It's all we've ever known, so it's pretty understandable why we would. But we come to love a lot of things here. We invest in things, we collect things, we gather things, we guard them, we protect them, we insure them. and we can have a really strong attachment to this world. But it only takes a cancer diagnosis or a heart attack to help us get our priorities straight and to make us release our tight grip on this world. I think it helps us see that people are more important than things, God more vital to us than our possessions, our faith more important to us than who we know or where we've been on vacation or any of those things. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't value our life here, but it does mean that sometimes we can grip it so tightly we are distracted away from the things that really ought to concern us. Now, you notice I said it can do that. There's no guarantee. You probably know people like I do who, no matter what happens to them or what truths they seem to miss, they grip the world just as tight as they ever did. They may even grow resentful of the fact that they suffer. They may blame God. I think God intended that our suffering help us release our grip on this world. That we see the world differently so we don't hold it so tightly and we realize there is something better. Also, our suffering can open us up to the truth. The psalmist in Psalm 119 says, it was good that I was afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. He seems to be grateful for the fact that he suffered because that way he learned things he didn't learn otherwise. There is something about suffering that opens our ears to hear things we didn't hear before and to see things that we didn't see before. It's amazing how we suddenly value things that maybe we'd been taking for granted. So a simple evening meal with family, or a walk in the park with your spouse, or the laughter of a child, lots of things that we probably heard and experienced many times we didn't really appreciate at the moment, but now we do because we feel vulnerable, we feel threatened. And so we hear what we didn't hear before, and we see what we didn't see before. I am confident there are many. Now, I should say again that I said it can do that. It doesn't for everyone. Some people suffer and they just grow more stubborn and more prideful and more resentful or whatever. So it's not a guarantee that suffering is going to somehow turn your world around so that you see it the way it really is. But I think oftentimes, it is when we are knocked down that we suddenly begin to see and value and appreciate things that we didn't before. Now, the problem is we're people with short memories. So as soon as we're back on our feet, it's like going to the doctor, and the doctor says, well, look, you're going to have a heart attack if you don't lose weight. Well, I'm on the treadmill. But it isn't very long before I begin to, grow a little weary of the treadmill and lapse to old habits and ways, and then I have eventually end up back at the doctor and he tells me the same thing. So it's not like we get it down once and we're done. We're not always that good. I feel this is echo here. Can you still hear me? Okay. So it can work that way, but it doesn't have to. But it may well be that the times in which we learn the greatest lessons are the times when we're knocked down. I'd say we learn them better then than when we're in the throes of victory. It's when we're suffering that we see and hear things that we're missing. Number 3, our suffering can make us more useful to others. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but our suffering actually links us to people. A number of years ago, and this was when first time I noticed this, I went to the hospital. I was in Little Rock and went to the hospital and visited with a family of a man who was having heart surgery. And there were other church members there, and we're sitting around, a little group and everything, and it wasn't long, and the man was an older person, older than I was, and so most of the friends there were older, and they began to talk about their respective heart surgeries. And I said, I didn't have anything to offer, but I realized, that when someone is experiencing something, it almost seems to bring out all the people who've experienced it. And one would talk about his surgery and his rehab, and another do the same, and they'd compare and talk about what their friend was now going to be going through and everything. And I thought, this links people. Now, it's not the only thing that links people. Winning can link people, and working together can link people, but suffering links us to people in a way unlike many things. But in the process, it makes us more useful. Paul says in his letter to the Corinthians that God comforts us in our troubles so that we might comfort others in theirs. Comforts us so that we might comfort others in theirs. I'm convinced that many of you, or even though I don't know you that well, that many of you are really great comforters. And it may be because you have this compassionate nature, or the way you watched your parents comfort people. It could be a number of contributing factors, but I'm guessing that one thing involved that makes you a good comforter is you know what it is to suffer. Now, I can't comfort people in every way in a sense of linked experience, because there's a lot of things I haven't experienced. I do know what it is to lose your mother after her decade-long battle with cancer. I do know what it is to get an early morning phone call that your father has dropped dead of a heart attack. But there are a lot of other things I haven't experienced. So even though I might give comforting words, the Lord's words, I'm not linked in the same way, but people who've had those similar experiences, I feel linked with. We've lost a daughter to cancer. We lost a son. He was murdered in his sleep. There are certain things that I feel a kinship with people in a way that I don't with everyone, and you have the same experience. But it makes us able to be more useful because of our suffering. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that we want to go out and find ways to suffer. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that we need to appreciate that there is good that comes from that experience. You may recall that Paul in 2 Corinthians talks about his thorn in the flesh. And he prayed 3 times that God would take it away, and the Lord didn't take it away. But Paul said, this is for my good. The Lord has given me this for my good. He was able to, even though he didn't want it, and he wanted the Lord to take it away, he was able to see that in the long run, this is for my good. Now, saying that is easy. Feeling that way about it is not easy. Number 4, our suffering can deepen our fellowship with God. Now, there's no guarantee that it will, but it can. And it makes sense that it would, since He is the one who has the resources to meet our needs and provide what we need. So it's natural that we would run to Him. When we do, we go, we seek Him in prayer, and we read His Word to be comforted, and we come to the building, we worship with other Christians. We seek God in ways more, perhaps it's a desperation beyond what normally is the case. A lot of us wouldn't want to admit it out loud, but a lot of us would probably say, I pray more when I'm hurting than when I'm not. And I read more scripture at times when I'm really depressed or really hurting or whatever than at other times. Even though we know we ought to read all the time, we ought to be learning and growing all the time, that's not basically the way we are. We seek God when we need Him most. Well, while that doesn't necessarily speak really well of us, it at least points out the fact that it is in those moments that our fellowship with God is deepened. It can be strengthened. So suffering isn't something we want. It's not something we seek, but it's not exactly all bad. And that's the result of what God has done. That's God's blessing in our lives, even in the midst of our suffering. Now, the things that happen to us, the bad things that happen to us, do not have any meaning in and of themselves. We give them meaning. So we receive whatever suffering comes our way, and we give that suffering meaning by our response. Now listen to me carefully. And that response, the meaning we give to it is either that we honor God in our suffering or we dishonor Him. You are not defined by your suffering. You are defined by your response to suffering. You see, you can't say, well, look at me, I'm special, I have cancer. There are a gazillion people who have cancer. You're not defined because you have cancer. You are defined by your response to it. Response to suffering. If you remember the 12 spies sent into the land by Joshua, went into the land to explore it, spied out and everything, and they all saw the same thing. It wasn't like one group saw some things that the other group didn't see. They all saw the same thing, and thus they are defined by their response to what they saw. So what do we say? We say, well, 10 came back and they're fearful. That's what we remember about them. They're defined by their response to what they saw. And 2, Joshua and Caleb came back, and they're defined by a totally different thing. Their faith in God. We can take this land. It wasn't the experience or what they saw that defined them. It was their response to that. Now, no matter what it is you experience, no matter what problem you have, no matter what difficulty, no matter what pain, no matter what burden, the devil says you won't be faithful to God. God says you will. That's the difference between, one of the differences between God and Satan is Satan doesn't believe in you, God does. Isn't that the story of Job? They got this argument going on. God says, have you considered my servant Job? Satan says, yeah, I have, but he's got all this stuff, and the only reason he serves you is because you gave him all this stuff and you put a hedge about him and you don't let anything bad happen to him. And God said, okay, we'll let something bad happen to him. So suddenly he loses all of his flocks and herds, so his wealth is gone, and he loses all of his children, 10 of them in one day, one storm, one collapse of a building. His wife says, curse God and die, so she's not exactly supportive. His whole body is covered in boils, top of his head, bottom of his feet. And God's only restriction is you can't take his life. Can't take his life. Now I think, and we're going to come back to Job in a minute. In fact, if you want to go ahead, well, no, don't do that just yet. I think we think about Job in terms of all this happening and that we think about him enduring and surviving. And it's true, he endures, and it is to his credit that he endures through all this. But I hope we understand that's not exactly what God was saying. God wasn't saying that Job is the kind of man who's going to hang on by his fingernails, and that's the most he can hope for. God expressed his faith in Job as someone who would be faithful, who would grow, who would emerge out of this a better man, a stronger man. Not just that he'd just simply grit his teeth and endure. That's what suffering is about. Look over in Romans chapter 5, if you will. Romans chapter 5, and I'm going to read at verse 3. Romans 5, verse 3. Not only so, but we also rejoice in our sufferings. We rejoice in our sufferings. That's not exactly the way I would describe my response, but that's what Paul says. We rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. And hope does not disappoint us because God has poured out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit whom he has given us. Rejoice in our sufferings. Why? Because it produces good things, better things, things that describe a growing kind of character. The idea wasn't that we suffer and we just hang on and nothing changes about us. We just endure till it's past. The idea is you become a better person. You grow. We are fragile creatures, and we are fearful creatures. And never is that more true in our lives than when two particular things crash into our situation with such an impact. And one is that we can't avoid it, and the other is we can't control it. We are most vulnerable, most desperate, most afraid when we can't avoid it and we can't control it. If we could avoid it, then we would do what's necessary to avoid it. Or if we could control it, then we would do what's necessary to control it. But when something comes into your life that's unpleasant and you can't avoid it and you can't control it, that's when we feel most vulnerable, most afraid. That was Job's experience. He couldn't avoid it. He couldn't control it. And we'll point out in a minute, he doesn't even understand why. So things happen to us, and we couldn't do anything to avoid it, and we can't do anything to control it, so now we are at the mercy of whatever. And that's when life is hardest for us. So, if you will look back at Job chapter 1, Job helps us here. Job helps us here in a way that we don't find very often. Job chapter 1, at the very end of chapter 1, after all this has taken place, it says, we're looking now for Job's response. Verse 20. At this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head, fell to the ground in worship, and said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. In all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. What does he do? He can't avoid it, and he can't control it. What is his response? His response is to worship, to express strong faith in God, and to guard carefully against sin. Now that's the remedy, the recipe, whatever you want to call it. That should be our response to suffering. Now, say again, if you can do something about it, then I think God expects you to do something about it. If you can control it, manage something, then why wouldn't you? But if it's something that you cannot avoid and you cannot control, then we are left in this, I started to say desperate situation. We probably feel desperate, but what is the response you make? You worship God, you express your strong faith and trust in God, and you guard carefully against sin. Now, wouldn't you like to be that kind of person? I'm guessing there are few of us who that's our first response. That may be our response later on once we've grappled and fretted and worried and done all this other stuff, but I doubt that's our initial response. But I think that is the example that we want to follow. And all of that is true even though Job has no explanation or reason why he's suffering. If God had said, Job, let me tell you what's going on. Satan and I have got this little deal going. He's betting against you. I'm betting for you. I think Job could have said, okay, I'm in with you. We got this covered. But he didn't tell him that. He hasn't got a clue why he is suffering. In fact, so great is the mystery that when his friends Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar come along, and they try to give him advice and counsel, and they'll say, well, you must have sinned terribly because all this bad stuff is happening. He said, no, I haven't. I don't know. I don't know what it's about. suffering is especially painful when there seems to be no reasonable explanation why. Now, I understand why someone suffers if they do something stupid. But I understand how disease work gets in the body. I understand the mechanics of those things. That's not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about understanding. I can't give a comforting explanation. Now, I can give comforting words, the words of God, but I can't give a comforting explanation, reason why, for the collapse of the condominium building in Florida that killed some and didn't kill others. Now, I realize they are doing a very thorough investigation and come back with reports that will say, well, the building structurally was weak here, or this was a problem there. I understand that. I'm not talking about that kind of explanation. I'm talking about the explanation of why it is that some people were visiting there for the very first time that night, and why there were others who lived there and had an invitation to be elsewhere and didn't come home that night. That's the understanding I'm talking about. And as long as I live, and as long as their family members live, they will never get an explanation for that. They can tell them why the building fell, but they can't tell why it is that certain people were there and certain people were not. I understand that if you take a gun and you walk into a store or a restaurant and you just start shooting people, shooting strangers and so on, I understand why people can be hurt or die, because that's the nature of shooting a gun at them. But I can't explain to family members why they happened to be the strangers in that place at that time. Tornadoes come and they rip up one side of the street, but not the other. Then they skip over 2 blocks and take in a row of houses there. Now, I can tell you things, I can explain some things relative to the behavior of tornadoes and weather and all of that. I can understand that, but I can't explain to you why it is they chose this house and not that house. If an individual is mentally ill, then I can understand why, if they take a gun and walk out into the intersection and start shooting people, I can understand why that happened, because they're mentally ill. What I can't explain in any comforting way now is I can't explain why Mrs. Smith, who never walks to work, just chose that morning to walk to work. And why Mrs. Brown, who always walks to work, chose that morning to drive. Or why Mr. Jones decided that was a morning that even though he usually cleaned the glass in his shop outside, that morning he chose just let it go. Didn't need it, so he wasn't a target. But why Mr. Brown, who never, ever jogs through that part of town, decided that morning, I think I'm going to make my morning run down this road. You never get answers to those things. We get answers to the mechanics of the way the world works, but we don't get answers to the things that involve people. So what is our hope? In such uncertainty, in such an uncertain world, what is our hope? Jesus. Now, one other place to read, Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2. Verse 14. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might destroy him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery for their fear of death. For surely it is not angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he has to be made like his brothers in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, and he is able to help those who are being tempted. The story of the Bible is the story of God's, we might say, his pursuit of us. He made us a place to live, the Garden of Eden, and what did we do? We found a way to run ourselves out. I mean, he ran us out, but we did it to ourselves. And since that time, God has pursued us. He doesn't pursue us because he needs us. It's not that kind of pursuit. He pursues us because he loves us. And the story of his pursuit is all kinds of individuals, through the lives of individuals in a nation, and instructions and all kinds of things, but it culminates in God becoming man. What does he do? He joins the human race. And he doesn't just come down and join the human race. He comes down and suffers with the human race. God knows all about rejection. He knows all about pain. He knows all about suffering. He knows what it is to be right, but yet treated as though you've done wrong. We sing songs like, "Does Jesus care? Oh, yes, he cares." How can we sing that? Because that's the truth. That's the truth. So in our suffering, God does understand. He does know what's going on, and he knows we don't have an explanation for everything. But in its place, he gives us a promise. You don't necessarily understand it all here, but one day you will. We even have songs that express that view. One day we'll understand. So that what matters is not that we seek an explanation. I don't have to figure it out loud. I don't have to understand. What I want is victory. I want victory just like Jesus had victory. That's what he promised me. We don't live our lives asking the question, why did this happen to me? Or why does this happen at all? It's not a question of why. The question is, where does it lead? Where does it lead? We're all going to suffer various kinds of ways. Sometimes we can do something about it. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes it doesn't. But the Lord says, trust me. And we ask, where does this lead? What kind of person am I going to be, am I going to become by virtue of going through this? That doesn't mean I like it. Doesn't mean I'm not going to pray for God to remove it. But if I can't avoid it and I can't control it, is it going to lead me toward glory or toward shame? Is it going to lead me in a way that honors God or one that dishonors Him? That's the question. I don't know of anyone who's going to, if they had to sign up for suffering, I don't know of anyone who's going to be first in line or even get in line. But since that is our lot as humans, should we not accept it in the sense of realizing that it has a purpose? And its purpose, like everything else, its purpose is to focus our attention on God. Hasn't God done everything always for our benefit? Is there any way in which God has done something that isn't intended to be a blessing in our lives, even if to us it didn't look like a blessing? Now, I am well aware that what I've said is easy to say and hard to live. I know that. And I would never offer myself as a sterling example of all I've just said. But even though I don't do it perfectly, I still know that it's the truth. And you won't do it perfectly, but I hope you believe it's the truth. Because we want to live for God no matter what. No matter what. And as evidenced by your prayer list, the announcements you've made, there are a lot of people suffering. There have always been a lot of people suffering. There always will be a lot of people suffering. There will be everybody suffering. What does God want us to do with that? He wants us to honor Him. He wants us to honor Him. He's not happy about our suffering. I don't want to leave the wrong impression. God empathizes with us, but He wants us to trust Him. He wants us to honor Him. I hope that will help you be a better comforter to others. I hope that will help you in your own life. I hope it will remind you that God is with you and that He does care. I hope it'll help us to be more focused in the way we should live. We sing a song of encouragement and invitation, and we do that because we don't want to fail to give anyone an opportunity to make their wishes known. If they have some need, some desire, a question, whatever, we want to help in any way that we can. And we invite you to come while we stand and sing the song.